let me just record it. Okay,
Okay.
that should be working. Well, great. Thank you so much. I'm Laura, and
Hi.
I'm so excited to be speaking to you. I have been wanting to have you come to our literary festival for years at this point. And of course, now you're going to be part of it when it's all remote and you can't actually be on campus, which is kind of a drag, but I'm still very glad that you're going to be part of it. So thanks for doing that. And
Oh,
thank
well,
you.
thank you. I'm glad it's possible in
I know,
some way.
I
Yeah,
know.
I
Me
know
too.
we're like, everyone is kind of, at this point, campus visits are like, okay, let's hope, it's touch and go. No one knows really for sure.
I know, yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that eventually, this all goes back to normal, I guess. I don't know. I have a lot of anxiety about things going back to normal, whatever that is.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I think it'll take everybody a while to ease in, at least the physical spaces and those types of things. Yeah.
right. Yeah. Well, let me just I'm doing this for my students because the way I've been teaching this semester, well, and also for me because, I am a fan and have wanted to talk to you about specifically The Farming of Bones, which is the novel of yours that I teach um, with a lot of regularity. And I posted on Facebook that I was going to be interviewing you and that if any of my past students had questions that they wanted me to ask, that they should let me know. And one of them emailed me like immediately from like 10 years ago. And I was like, really? I've been teaching this book that long. But she had a
Oh,
question. So I'll ask you about that, what she wanted to ask in a bit. But I
sure.
I teach post-colonial literature and I teach non-Western world literature. So I do a lot of kind of, survey teaching of lots of different places, and the Caribbean is one. And, unfortunately, because of the kind of teaching I do, I don't get to focus a whole class on a specific place. It's more kind of a survey. So
Hmm.
that's, kind of that's sort of the background for this. But I really I wanted to ask you questions about that novel, also about Haiti. And so I guess if I can just kind of start,
Sure.
if you could introduce yourself to my students, and
Okay.
if you could talk to them maybe a little bit about your background, um, why you started writing. And I know you've been writing since you were a teeny tiny child, and kind of when that started, and um, just your journey to where you are now. That would be great.
Okay. So my name is Edwidge Danticat. I'm a writer. I was born in Haiti in 1969. When I was two, my dad moved to the US and my mom joined him when I was four. And I was raised by my aunt and uncle in Haiti. My parents and I were reunited when I was 12 because when they came to the US, they had overstayed tourist visas and were undocumented. So it took them a while to get their papers in order and send for us. So I moved to Brooklyn at age 12.
Mm.
I didn't speak English. I had to learn English. I had to get used to my family. And it was around 1981 at that time when, so this is my second pandemic.
Yeah.
I arrived at the US at the very beginning of the AIDS epidemic. And at that time, in the news all over the place, you would hear that there were the four H's were at high risk for AIDS. It was homosexuals, hemophiliacs, heroin addicts, and Haitians. And the Haitians were the only people who were placed in that category by nationality. So when I arrived, it was, people didn't know very much about AIDS, how it was transmitted, and most of the people I knew, my parents knew, worked in the service industry or were caretakers for older people and lost their jobs really because people didn't know. And so at school, when I started school in Brooklyn, we were teased, we were called names. So it was a tough landing. But I found my way really through, I had a very strong family unit. I had a strong community unit. My parents belonged to a church, and most of the people in the church lived in our building. So that there was that community there, but there was also, I found my way through reading, through books.
Mhm.
And I started reading all really the Haitian literature that I didn't get a chance to read in Haiti. And that wasn't really taught in school at the time. I was reading those in French from the Brooklyn Public Library. And then I started reading in English. The first book I read in English was Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. I read a lot of it with a dictionary, but there was something very recognizable to me about it because it was a young girl who grew up not with her mother and father, who had been sent to her grandmother, who was a very strong presence in her life, like my aunt was and my uncle was in my parents' absence. And she also, had some traumatic experiences and at some point was shipped back to her mother, and had to adjust. So that book kind of landed in my path at the right moment. And I think also because it was so honest in terms of things like the sexual abuse and all of, just it was so raw in some ways that I felt like, and it gave me permission to write a book like Breath, Ice, Memory, like to write a book that was also raw and just like could bother certain people. And so, I felt like if I hadn't read that book at that moment in time, I would not have realized that books like that were possible and that young girls could read them. So then when I went to high school, I started writing for my high school literary magazine and newspaper. And I also started writing for New Youth Connections, which was a paper in New York City that was distributed throughout the city. And one of the essays I wrote, kind of about my first day in New York, led me on the path to writing my first novel, Breath, Ice, Memory. So
Wow,
once I was done with that essay, I wanted to continue. So that was the beginning of my journey to books, to writing.
that is great. That is yeah, amazing. And just I mean, what a great resource to be able to write in a youth newspaper. Like I had read that about you too, and just thought that was a really cool thing. I think so. I was born in 1970, so we're about the same age.
So,
And yeah, and I was, when you said that about, the AIDS epidemic or pandemic, yeah, I remember the experience of that, obviously very differently, being a straight white woman in the South, the sort of villainization of gay men was what, sort of resonated with me. So I had read, one of the things that I do with my students is have them look at images of Africa, specifically in popular media. And and then they have to sort of deconstruct like what that image is. And one of the images that they focused on or have focused on in the past couple of years has been, Trump's disparaging of African countries. And I know you had written also about his rhetoric around Haiti and the AIDS crisis, and how he inflamed that again after all that time. So I just, yeah, thought that was,
mhm.
yeah, just terribly upsetting.
Yeah, well, I think he was very good at using tropes,
Yeah.
and certainly that was one of those tropes that he evoked from that period of time. And I think, New York City was certainly one of the epicenter. San Francisco was also of the AIDS epidemic.
Mhm.
So um, and one of the things that actually, one of the pivotal moment in Haitian American, in the Haitian-American archive was this march that happened in 1990, where so many people marched on the Brooklyn Bridge to try to get the FDA to reverse uh, that designation, because it turned out that it wasn't so scientifically based after all. And then people had trouble, donating blood to their own relatives if they needed to. So it was a really really tough time.
Yeah, it was. And I still, in everything that's going on right now with COVID and the fact that we have this vaccine, I can't, just how many times I have thought, I can't believe that we still don't have a vaccine for AIDS. And then, then I'm
Yeah,
like, of course I can. I believe that because of the way that the Reagan administration depicted who was suffering and, just
yeah.
ignored it for so long. So, yeah.
Well, I think also one of the like the nuances of literature too in this whole story is that so when I edited a book called The Butterfly's Way: Voices from the Haitian Diaspora in the United States, and that sent me a path to in the path of a writer named Isoto Saint, who was both Haitian and gay, and one of the first to write about that experience. And it was, he had a very interesting experience too, in that, because he was coming at the sort of the homophobia of his own community. And then, the fact that, and I think at the end of it all, we all came to conclude that we are all living with AIDS because we know people or we love people so when a stigma is forced on you in the first place, then you kind of you're protesting so much that you end up wounding people who are also in this community that is also stigmatized, that is also suffering, where people are dying. So he was actually the perfect writer um, to bridge for me and so many others in the community that gap between being uh, both Haitian and gay, and speaking, from both of those experiences at that time.
Yeah. Tell me, what was his name again?
His name was Asoto Saint. That's the name he took on,
Okay.
and he had a really beautiful hybrid collection of poems and essays called "Spells of a Voodoo Doll." Yeah,
So
but
that,
he,
okay, go
yeah.
ahead.
And so Asoto is the name of a Vodou Loa,
Mhm.
a spirit, and Saint was from Toussaint Louverture. So he was a very
Okay.
interesting writer of that period. I mean, sometimes you're like, and that's interesting too for students, people who are learning literature. Sometimes, the right, like, you're struggling to express something, or you're struggling to find an emotion, and sort of like you find the right writer, and you're like, yes, that's what I need to hear at this moment. Yeah.
Yeah,
And he was that for me at that time.
that's really important. My experience, I wanted, so I'm going to ask you about voodoo since you said spells with voodoo doll, because I have all sorts of questions for you. But I wanted to be a writer when I was younger, a writer of fiction, and I remember reading certain writers and just realizing that I could never do what they did. That was my, I
Mm.
mean, which is, I guess, an awful way to, I mean, just being blown away by the works of specific writers, and also going, there's no reason for me to even try because there's no way I can get close to it. So I think, being able to read someone and be inspired by them is just, really, it's important, especially when you're a youngish person, not to be discouraged. So
Oh
that's
yeah,
really cool.
I think for me, I was just like hungry for for
Yeah.
that. Like, I was just really inhaling the stuff I was reading
Mhm.
because I was just looking like everywhere for it, and I realized, and probably it's a kind of being in the school newspaper, being with youth connections helped out a lot with that, because
Mhm.
I was already at home fighting with this reality of, like, you have to be a doctor, you have to be a nurse, you have to really do something that's like contributing to the
Mhm.
society. So I already had that. So for me, it was just like, I'll take in as much as I can, and
Mhm.
then I'll just try to write whatever I can. And I feel like in a way I'm still like that. Like, if I'm more sort of, I'm a big reader, but I feel like I'm always looking for something that, like, when I'm working on something and I'm stuck and I'm reading, that there's like, you find little triggers, like something to encourage you along the way.
Yeah. So actually, before I ask you my voodoo question, then can I, because I'm afraid I'll forget to ask,
Mhm.
do you have other like specifically Caribbean or Haitian writers that you would recommend to maybe like my students who, you know, are only getting just a taste of the Caribbean?
Yeah, well, there are quite a few now. And I would say to get a sample, I edited these two anthologies with Akashic books called Haiti Noir and Haiti Noir 2.
Okay.
And we tried in those books, and they tend to be, you know, noir is very loosely defined. You know, it's kind of not like the American noir, you know, that genre, but
Mm-hmm.
it's sort of, you know, stories with that bent. And but so one is it takes just short stories from writers who are Haitian-American, Haitian-Canadian, but also then who and then two has some classics, so much older stories that you get a sense of who the writers are. But I would recommend, I think in translation, a writer named Marie-Vieux Chauvet. But if you're just starting, Langston Hughes and Mercer Cook translated a book called uh, Masters of the Dew. So if they start with that, you know, you get a sense. It's one of the, you know, seminal texts of Haitian literature,
Mm.
and it talks of, you know, it's Jacques Romain, who also was what they, you know, we'd call a writer who's engagé, who was sort of civil-minded, who wanted to really his literature to contribute to something. And the fact that it's Langston Hughes who did the translation
Yeah.
is offering a good selling point for people who are just starting
Yeah.
um, to explore this literature.
Okay, great. Thank you. I will obviously share that with them. Okay, so now I'm going to ask you my voodoo question. So
Okay.
this is, so like I said, I often teach Farming of the Bones, which I just think is such a great work about the recovery of memory and, you know, the post-genocide, all of these things that are happening. And I had kind of a question, I guess, just about your sensibilities with regard to how voodoo functions in the Caribbean. And also, so I read that novel. I had this epiphany, and this is going to seem so dumb to you if I'm wrong, and I feel really like obnoxious even saying it, but that I read the character of Sebastian as a representation of Granbois, and
Oh.
yeah, and T-Bon as the sort of the guardian of the crossroads, like the
The
character.
Baron.
Yeah, and then
Huh.
the professor at the end as the Baron Cimetière. He's like right, because he's sort of, you know, Amabel at the end is in this space of being in the water and neither, you know, sort of he's there almost like I feel waiting for her to die, and then he walks away. And so, you know, that is
Oh,
my,
wow.
if I ever write about your novel, that's gonna be my position in it. But then, you know, there's also all these other things that are kind of the doll that Amabel, you know, believes she has as a child. And that was actually my student's question, really wanted to know about the doll that her mother says doesn't exist. And so I just kind of
Oh,
wondered,
wow.
yeah.
Well, I'll have to tell you, like, I'm not aware that anyone has done that interpretation, but I am intrigued. I think it's it's totally valid. I hadn't thought about it in that way, you know.
Wow.
And as you just said it, I thought, yes, the water. I'm just really consumed with water imagery. I
Yeah.
think coming from an island, I guess, and the crossing water. You know, the fact that, for example, you know, in Haitian Creole, Lord Baudelaire, the other side of the water means going abroad, or it could also mean dying. It has the same, you know, three words has like this dual meaning that's
Mhm.
always sort of haunted me. So yeah, and agriculture is, I think it might be more like azaka, but there are different manifestations for sure.
Mhm.
Nobody's brought it up before. You're,
Oh, I'm very proud
well,
of myself. Good.
yes, but absolutely, I can see it, and I can see the doll as being a kind of, you know, Brigitte, or, you know, sort of death imagery figure.
Mm-hmm.
I have a doll also. When you said that, I realized I was like, I have a doll also in Breath Ice Memory. I guess, for me, the dolls um, were also a symbol of my mother's absence, because
Mm.
growing up in Haiti, there was a doll, there were two kinds of doll. You could get, like, there were no black dolls at that time. So you could get
Right.
at Christmas these very big white dolls. And then you would have to have, and I had, we had baptisms for the dolls. A
Mm-hmm.
doll had a godmother, like a godfather, and you got some cookies, you had a reception. So when you had a new doll, and so I would get those dolls, but I would also get these types of dolls called Poupée France, which were like French, like these kind of porcelain ones,
Oh,
where if you're given one of those, you do the baptism, everything, but then the doll goes on a shelf, like you're not even allowed to play with it.
right.
But my mother would send me these dolls from abroad. So for me, even though it was a fun thing, but they also represented this kind of absence. And the dolls never looked like anybody we knew.
Right.
So that was also another layer of absence. So they might as well have been a spirit, and
Yeah.
I was thinking, I write a little bit about in The Art of Death that I used to, have these dolls that I made also out of paper.
Mm.
And then I read Sula, and Toni Morrison talked about, headless dolls. And I had these
Yeah.
headless dolls. And it makes you start thinking, like, all the imagery that a little girl, who's without a mother can
Yeah.
wrap around a doll, because a doll is almost like it's a transfer of love. It was for me. It was kind of
Right.
the doll literally represented my mother, which can also be tied to these spirits, because there's an absence in spirits, right? You don't see everything. And
That's
there's also, I think, in not just in Vodou, but in different religions, where objects can transfer energy,
mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I always felt like I was looking at those dolls. I was like, that's my mother's energies there, because she
Oh,
had gone through this trouble to send it to me all the way from across the water. But they didn't look like her. They didn't look like me. And sometimes they would leer at me from where they were kind of displayed. So I hadn't even realized how much dolls kept showing up in my.
oh, that's so interesting because yeah, the doll in the Farming of Bones is so it's has always been really interesting to me because it's like the doll Emma Bell says is made out of like a corn husk and it's got
Mhm.
buttons for eyes. And then when she asks her mother about it, her mother's like, no, there was no doll. And so
Yeah.
my read was always that there was a doll and that this was it was some sort of caretaking. It was like magic or energy that was in this doll. And then when she comes out of the fever, her mother's like denying it because perhaps admitting to it would be dangerous in in the Dominican Republic, or I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah, well, I don't know either that far, but those types of dolls were, even I, like, when we're in the country, would make these dolls, because you had, um, with the corn husk, and then you had
Yeah.
the fine, we made those corn husk dolls all the time, and they were very easy to make. So she might have, a child could have easily made that. And then
Right.
parents sometimes don't always remember. Um, but yeah, I mean, I could see, again, if someone were making, if you're making a kind of sacred object, you could make it with a corn husk. You could make it with things that are so of the earth, right? So natural. I mean, and I don't,
Right.
and I think you could find that in so many different religion. When I would look at these corn husks, I would think of, some of the sort of the Brazilian um, candomblés,
Mhm.
masks, and and I think, people, especially in African diaspora religions, where you land on this somewhere else, and you're practicing your religion without the grounding of where it came from, and you have to adapt to where you are. So I think there's a lot of different ways that it could manifest. And people had to keep, like, I think with the anti-superstition campaigns and things of that nature, people had to keep their religious practices secret in most cases. So that could have been, the mother could have given it more, um, meaning than she realized. But you kind of read this whole other energy to it that that is really powerful that I had not frankly thought of. So
Well, that's what I mean. I
so
love
good
that.
for you.
That's what's fun about, being a professor, teaching literature. Like if you're a reader, I always tell my students, like, we could ask authors, we could say, what did you mean with this thing? But, the readers always bring these things to the text as well. And so to some extent, what you meant is important. And also what I see in it is equally important, I think. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously, but
Oh no, yeah,
yeah.
you're absolutely right. I always, when, and especially high school students, younger students will say, "Did you mean this?" And I said, "It's your book." Like,
Yeah, exactly.
I'm
Exactly.
like, it's your book. Like, if you can really interpret it, and very often, like just now, someone will read something that I didn't read, that I didn't realize, that was
Mhm,
maybe subconscious,
mhm,
or I'll make a connection that I didn't make, and I think that's the value of it too. It's like there's a sharing, a
mhm.
kind of communication, and like this between the reader and the book. So I always say to students too, I say, when you buy the book, it becomes yours. It's your book now.
I love that you
Yeah,
tell them that,
yeah,
because I always say that too. I'm like, what the author meant is, it's interesting to know what the author meant, but it's also somewhat immaterial to you when you're reading it. So
yes,
that's great that you have
yeah.
that attitude, I think.
Oh no, I think it's a conversation. It's not a monologue,
Mhm,
and even for the person writing the story, it's an exploration.
mhm.
And it ages, it changes as you get older. And even for students, the works that they're reading now with you, if they read them in 10 years or 20 years, it's like reading, you read with your whole life story behind you.
Right.
And as that changes, as you change, the way you read things changes as well, as you also gain new knowledge about
Mhm.
the world, about yourself. Your reading changes, your interpretation of things change.
Yeah. So I had actually one more question about that novel, and then I wanted to talk to you about just other things in general. But speaking of like bringing your whole life to something when you're reading it, was teaching I was teaching your novel, teaching that novel, um, right after Trump won the election in 2016, and we were reading the Trujillo sort of speech that he makes. He's on the radio and the family's sort of listening to him, and he's saying all these things about the Haitians, and how they must be stopped. And I can't remember exactly, but it just really, I kept thinking and my students did too. It was like we had this aha moment of, hearing Trump say same things about Mexican immigrants to the United States. And I wondered just if you could kind of maybe talk a little bit about the way, I mean, your experience as an immigrant, I think, is really, really interesting. And also maybe how you see the United States at this particular moment in terms of its relationship to immigrants. Yeah, that's not really about your novel, but
Yeah. Oh
it's
no, no, that's fine. I mean, well, about going back to the novel, I read a lot of biographies of Trujillo when I was writing the novel, and most of them were ones that he had commissioned and sort of super flattering of him. But there were some things that came through, like these declarations that he would make, and he also had this very interesting relationship with the people in power on the other side. It was kind of a collusion of elites there too,
Mhm.
where the elites of Haiti didn't really um, they didn't really care about what was happening to the poor in Haiti over there, mostly either. And there was the U.S. occupation that had just ended, so they had really created this structure, sort of this hierarchy in the country based on skin color and a kind of tropical Jim Crow,
Yeah.
So there was a lot happening there too, like in the sugar interests
Right.
that came with the imperialism and so, um, but so also, I mean, to start there is that I do think, people with those attitudes are they don't differ so much from each other, right?
Right.
Like the, 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 the people that are scapegoating change, the circumstance change, the reasons sometimes are more glossed over but they tend to have a very similar discourse.
Mhm.
So as an immigrant in this country right now, I mean, I think it's, as a Haitian immigrant, I'm still troubled. I think even with the changes of administration today, makes, or yesterday, like the 27th deportation flights of Haitians
Wow.
that were sent to Haiti since this new administration, and we're still, trying to get. People are really fighting now very much to get TPS, the temporary protected status, redesignated for Haiti, especially when there's a lot of violence in Haiti now, and a
Yeah.
government that the U.S. supports, that the people don't support. And
Mhm.
so a lot of the same things are happening. And I was just reading a report by the NYU Law Clinic, that I'm going to be writing a forward for, where they actually go through the whole history of Haitian immigration in the US and its connection to, imperialism and US interest in Haiti, which goes back to when Haitian independence, when the US was like, we can't have that example, and just
Right.
didn't even have any relationships with Haiti, and then thought of Haiti, doing the I think it's Andrew Jackson, like in 1868, they thought of annexing Haiti and the Dominican Republic. There's this whole long history that Americans are not really fully aware of, but there are things like in immigration, for example, like before Guantanamo was a place where they held, people who were, accused of being terrorists. They Haitians were there when they were leaving Haiti in the 90s,
Hmm.
after the coup. So there's
Right.
a model, in this report I'm learning there's a model. I knew some of that, but they have very specific cases. There's a model of detention that was established for Haitian immigrants that is now used for a lot of people, like at the border. And so it's a very long and complicated, um, you know, history with the US and Haiti, starting with them being the first two, republics in this hemisphere. One still, enslaving people, another one where enslaved people had started their own republic.
Right.
So so immigration factors into that, and also I think anti-blackness, and I feel like sometimes U.S. policy is Democratic or Republican is always based on whether like people are going to come here by the thousands by boat, or
Right.
that's sort of runs through the history of immigration here. So as some as it gives it gives a lot of pause. I mean, I have to think about my uncle died in immigration custody, which I wrote about in Brother I'm Dying.
Yeah.
So you're always in, I think, as an immigrant in the US, especially through the last 4 years, you always feel whether you're in or not, like
Right.
you're in a mixed status family, right?
Yeah.
Because family is defined so broadly, because people who are citizens, people who are residents, people who have DACA, people who have TPS, people who are undocumented. So it's a whole, very big community that's balancing all that. And sometimes all these people can be in one family.
Right.
Um, that's the nature of sort of current immigration in the US.
Yeah. Wow. That is a great answer. I was thinking, sorry, just as kind of an aside, you have again this line in The Farming of Bones that is, a border is a veil not many people can wear. And I love that
Mhm.
line so much. I was talk about it. I've used it a lot in talking about US policy with regard to our southern border with Mexico, and just, the way that this idea of being like the border being this place that you can't occupy. Like there's no way to be on the border. You either have to be one thing or the other, inside or outside. And just that the idea of borders being these arbitrary kind of made up things that determine so much about a person's status just in the world is, so fascinating and upsetting.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in the case of Haiti and the Dominican Republic,
Yeah.
this border was constantly moved during the US. There's a joint occupation of Haiti and the Dominican Republic from 1916 to 1924. And they were, like the US engineering service was always shifting that border.
Right.
And so people might wake up one day in Haiti, and then the week of they say, so it was also, the fluidity of that border to serve in this imperialistic, colonial need and
Right.
commerce, and and so it's also like who controls the borders. But I was watching this thing today, and there's so much, like I live in South Florida, so there's so much that people, like I remember when I moved here, when people talked about climate, they talked about it like it was like so far into the future. But we have like climate migration now.
Yeah.
And it's going to increase. I was,
Yeah.
with these hurricanes that happen. And today I was watching this volcano,
Yeah.
and in the Grenadines and St. Vincent, and the UN had a report not too long ago where they said like there's going to be climate migrants will soon form the 5th largest country in the world, like this moving country,
Right.
of millions and millions of people literally with no place to go.
Right.
And so I think we're just starting with this conversation about immigration, about migration itself. We saw it in Europe. And we're going to see more of it
Yeah.
on this side. And it'll be just as Toni Morrison say, like it will so depend on how we define the stranger. Is it someone we take in or someone we leave out? So I think that's going to be for the next, not even we're just in the next decade. Now it's now.
Yeah, no, exactly. And yeah, that idea of this nation of climate migrants, people who are, without a border, is interesting too, because then that sort of challenges the whole concept of what a nation is and how you determine where people fit. All right, I have this ancient dog who's in the background crying because he's fallen. I'm going to go get him in a minute, but
go ahead. You must have heard my dog.
Yeah, no, I just don't. Well, will you hang out?
Go ahead. I'll hang on. Yes.
I'll be right back.
We'll pause. Okay.
Okay, no, I'll be right back. And then I have one more question for you.
Okay. Okay. Is the dog okay?
Yeah, he's really old, and he falls, and then he can't get up, and he starts crying.
Oh my goodness.
He's breaking my heart. But yeah, I could hear him, and I was like, he's okay. And then he started getting louder and louder, and I was like, okay, just pick him up so he can walk around and he'll be okay. So he's walking around now. But
good, yeah, we have a puppy. But
I could hear. Yeah, I could hear. Good. I'm glad I'm not the only. As soon as your dog started barking, I was like, okay, good, because I can hear mine in the background too. Well, I'll ask you one more question and then I'll let you go, because this has been great. But I read your piece in the New Yorker. I know you do a lot of writing for the New Yorker. That was about George Floyd specifically, and you kind of you started sort of talking about the brutalization of migrants with Abner Louima, who I remember that so well in 1989, and just this kind of, constant that definitely predates that moment as well. But I wonder, and I mean, this is maybe just a question that no one can really answer, but I wonder if you feel like we've hit a turning point with George Floyd, or do you think it's just going to be, yet another case of nothing happening?
Well, I hope it's not just another case of nothing happening,
Yeah.
because, I mean, there's been, like, I watched bits of the trial now and then. But I can't watch the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I've been asked to write about it, but I feel like if I had to write about it, I would have to watch each and every one of that testimony.
Yeah.
And it's heartbreaking. The one day I watched a lot was when they had the young people from the store.
Yeah.
And, the young girl, like the young people I watched, because I was thinking of their psyche,
Yeah.
and how each one of them will be forever affected by that. We watched the video, and you can't, like, I can never watch it all the way through,
No, I can't either.
because it's so brutal and so casual. So I think in the summer, when we had all the protest, and when I would go to some here, I would see some very young people,
Mhm.
and very young, from all different backgrounds, and that made me hopeful. I think that's what I think is different, and that what some people are calling woke is a kind of awareness in young people. And
Yeah.
Anna Devere Smith was saying that she thought it was because a lot of young people have been reading Toni Morrison. They've been reading this kind of, Ta-Nehisi. They've been reading this kind of literature,
Mhm.
whether on their own or in school, which is like the kind of thing the other side criticizes
Yeah.
as indoctrination. But a lot of that has opened young people's eyes. So there were young people in the streets. They were, this was their cause, who had grown up in this, multiracial, multicultural society, and had friends from different races who were on the street,
Yeah.
who were allies, who were. So I think that's the part that I hope is different.
Yeah.
It's not so much of the sort of the power structure. If anything, I can see some cops getting really angry, or
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
or people feeling like they, like, I can see maybe some things were boiled by the trial, that they've become resentful.
Mhm.
But what I think is different are the people in the population who are reacting,
Yeah.
younger people. So seeing them at the protests, and so, like, some of them were doing poetry readings, land acknowledgements, and they were there every single time.
Mhm.
So that for me felt different. And I know a lot of people have said it in the moment, that felt hopeful.
Yeah.
I felt like they were young people who had other young people's back. I felt like they were peers of my daughters, who are 12 and 15, who understand who are better than their parents, what it is like to live in this skin, and who,
Mhm.
and there's also a lot of things that, the way young people get information, like the TikTok, and the people who are influencing them have direct access to them, for good
Right.
or for ill. but
Yeah.
but a lot of it is political, and they get sort of the quick take on certain issues, including systemic racism, including, the anti-Asian hate crimes. They, like, when something like that's happening, they get some younger, I guess, influencer person reacting in a way that is also eye-opening for them. So that's what I felt was different. I felt like
Mhm.
the environment, at least in these types of, I live in a city that is multicultural but still insular. People kind of stay in their way. But at these protests, there was a lot of that. So watching this trial, and then, it's like all these different ways that people are trying to explain why someone with their knees on your neck for 10 minutes can't kill you. I was like,
I know, right? Like, and yeah, I just keep thinking too, like, do we really need all of these witnesses for the prosecution to convince us that he was murdered? Like, we all saw it
yeah,
happen. So anyway, yeah.
it is. And I think that's the other thing. It's like Emmett Till. It's
Yeah.
like these really glaring cases where you're like, someone is defending the indefensible.
Right.
And even, and thank God, like this very, like one of the witnesses said, thank God there was a camera.
Yeah.
Because you're seeing it and they're telling you that's not what you saw. Can you imagine, like, if there was no video?
Yeah.
So that's also what's different, that there are these other ways of bearing witness.
Right.
And my heart broke when that young man said, he had a video, but he erased it. He said, well, I thought, and thank goodness that young woman
Held on.
recorded, and that, so I think that's the other tool that people have, are these, these cameras. Otherwise, that man would not even be on trial.
Right.
They would be like, oh, one other one died. And so
Yeah.
hopefully, I'm hopeful that this is a turning point. I I'm not one of those people who's 100% sure that there will be, that there won't be an acquittal.
Yeah.
I, that I think we have to sort of emotionally prepare for that as well.
Yeah.
Um, so, but my hope is in the young people.
Yeah.
I really think, and I think we've all, at the same time, have been through something really big together through the
Yes.
pandemic as well,
Hmm.
that that has allowed, and that was part of the protest too. People have had time to sit with certain things, and then when they went out, they were able to express their anger, their rage, their dissent.
Yeah.
Um, but we have, in ways that we're not fully able to express, gone through a big experience together this
Right.
year. And if anything, I hope that it's made people aware that we're codependent. Like,
Yeah.
we're really, what happens to one of us can happen to all of us. Like, we're all vulnerable in different ways, but
Hmm.
there are certain things that can really get us all. So I think
Yeah.
that's another thing that we've learned in a lot of different corners of the world, really.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you. And as you were saying all that about the young people, I mean, I've certainly seen it in my students. And we're in a pretty rural place. There is a city of Asheville, which is, very kind of cool, hip happening, liberal. I live in the city, so, I'm a little
Mm.
more urban, but the university where I teach is very rural and very not entirely homogeneously white, but predominantly certainly. And I saw my students, activated and in ways that I never have before. And I think, yeah, the for all of the harm and awfulness that the pandemic has brought, I do think it created a space for people to stop and think about what was happening. And I heard somebody say this, that the pandemic created the circumstances for which we could have had a movement like what we had after George
Mm-hmm.
Floyd died. So for that, I'm very thankful. And, I in trying to look for some sort of positivity in all of this bleakness around us.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And also, I mean, one of the hopeful elements of it was that it wasn't just here, it was, that's the thing I was intrigued by, that I try to write about, that it was in Paris, and it
Yeah.
was in Brazil, it was in all these other places where they were looking at this and they thought, this is obviously an extreme violation, an assassination.
Yeah.
But we also have things that happened around us in our country that we haven't been talking about.
Yeah.
So I think there was also a conversation about global injustice,
Yeah.
and global inequality, and that also arose out of that. And having literally your boot on the neck became a symbol for so much that has happened to so many people around the world. And I think that gave them a chance to express that as well.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thank you so much, Edwidge.
Thank you.
Yeah, I
All
really
right.
enjoyed meeting you finally. And thank you for being a part of the Lit Festival. And I really wish that I could meet you in person, and maybe someday that will happen.
Someday, yes.
Yeah.
We'll gradually get there.
Yes, definitely.
All right.
Well, thanks so much. And I will see you on Thursday when you're also, I think, being interviewed by some of my former students. So
Oh, okay. Yes. I'm looking forward to that.
yeah, that'll be fun.
All
All right.
right.
Take good care.
Thank you. You too. Good night.
Bye.